bicycle as transport. You were involved in, I guess, primarily bicycle racing and endurance or long-distance record-breaking rides, but could you tell me anything about the use of the bicycle generally in the population?
Well, as far as I was concerned, the bicycle was an indispensable asset to the post office. Following a short stint with the Melbourne Herald as a copy boy, I then had passed the examination for the post office, and in those days everybody in the public service almost commenced as a telegraph messenger, and accordingly I was posted to Malvern, where I rode a bicycle 6 days a week from morning till late afternoon, delivering telegrams. And the postman also used bicycles, and the technical people who were on the telephone exchange, the second automatic telephone exchange in Australia, were also using bicycles and going out for their maintenance work with carriers on the back and the bag of tools making a very heavy transport for them. But we accepted that the bicycle was transport, and that really spread throughout Australia. The message boys rode bicycles, people rode bicycles to work, particularly during the Depression. The bicycle was an indispensable, economical means of transport, and literally thousands and thousands of bicycles went over Prince's Bridge and came in from the northern suburbs of a morning, and accordingly went back at night.
Take it. With the bicycle racing, the popularity of bicycle racing seems to have waned to some extent from the days that you were a major figure in that field. Any ideas why that's happened?
Well, there's only one thing about it. I think cycle racing has more events now proportionate to the population than it did in my time. But it doesn't get the same coverage. We have splendid riders, we have world-class riders who by their performances prove that. But the emphasis on other sports is such as football and cricket and tennis and golf, who have high sponsorship. It rather blankets out the qualities of the riders and just the amount of cycling that we have in Australia at the present time. And when I was racing in the 30s, the early 20s and late 30s, I had almost 20 years of competitive work. We had Bruce Small, who later became Sir Bruce Small, who was developing the Malvern Star bicycle, and he is recognised as one of the most outstanding entrepreneurs that the cycling has ever had, and he made sure that it was hitting the headlines whenever there was anything worthwhile. I think that is the answer to your question. Overall, cycling today has never been more popular, right from the BMXs. How often do you see even a youngster on a tricycle? They're on the smaller machines that are being made for them, and then right up to the competitive side. Touring, for example, has never had the same popularity as it has today, where people from all classes of the community are ready to get on their machines and ride for what would be considered great distances some time ago. And cycle paths are being put down by various councils. All of those things indicate that cycling, in the broad sense, is selling more machines proportionate to population than perhaps it has since the days when it first came in the 1880s as a type of machine in general shape that you see that I am with now. Then, of course, it was a craze, and a craze doesn't last indefinitely. And other forms of transport came in and obliterated the bicycle because it requires personal effort. And until these later days, when people have gone through the easier transport stage and realised that they pay a penalty for it, and that they have to, or should do exercise to retain a reasonable standard of fitness, it's only now that the bicycle is coming back again as in that particular phase of its locomotion.
Could you tell me about that particular bicycle that you've got there?
Yes, this means a fair bit to me, this machine. It's the bicycle that I used in my last big ride before the war. That was in Sydney in 1940, and the first part of 1940, I think it was in January, and it was an attack on the 24-hour unpaced track record in Sydney. And this is the machine that I used.
Could you describe the kind of bicycle that it is, or?
Yes, it's a it's a track machine. Although I've altered it a fair bit just to ride around for my health rides. It's got, from comparison with a road bike, it has a short wheelbase, which, by the way, is a wheelbase that's used by the average road rider today, which is an indication of the development of roads, the smoothness of the surface compared with the times that this machine was built. But as it was the track, and for a smooth track, well, accordingly, it's got a track wheelbase for those times, although it's a wheelbase. That is the distance between the back wheel and from down here at the back stays up to the front axle. And that's the short wheelbase. And obviously, with a short wheelbase, as in a car, there's a greater vibration comes through. And from my old-timers viewpoint, I believe that the average road rider is using too short a wheelbase, and there is a vibration that, because of his form, he's not conscious of. But for an old-timer like me, I can assure you that I can feel when there's the difference between my road bike of the old days that I'm using and the short wheelbase of this on the roads.
I've got to change my back. The change in technology with the racing bikes. I believe that when you first started racing, the bikes didn't have changeable gears. I guess this would be road racing. Didn't have changeable gears and didn't have brakes.
That is so. In competitive work, I entered the competitive field in 1919, and obviously conformed to the regulations that governed cycling. And it was demanded by those regulations that we use a fixed wheel bicycle and no brakes, which actually, of course, was completely absurd, and I just cannot imagine why that particular rule was in vogue, except the explanation was that with a brake, you were in a bunch, you put the brakes on and you'd cause a fall, which was completely erroneous, of course. But we went through this formula, if you can call it that, of going down steep hills and having to back pedal and putting one hand on the top bar and using it to lever against the weight of the pedals which were whizzing around. And that didn't change until two cyclists named Ben Ogle and Jock O'Farrell went over to France and came back with this news of the two brakes on bicycles and what we termed the clutch, like as I've put on this one, the freewheel clutch. And after a couple of seasons, we were permitted to fit the clutch and the two brakes for racing, which made a tremendous difference to safety and also to speed. But then came in the later innovations, which
you start the bit again, then came in the later.
Then came in the later innovations, which meant that a cog with, or a two-tooth cog, not a two-tooth cog, a cog, two cogs were put on this side of the hub and two on the other side. And for changing of gears, we had wing nuts and descended from the bicycle as quickly as possible, of course, undid the wing nuts, and if you wanted, according to the gear that you required, you either picked the chain up and put it on the cog on the same side, or else you dropped the wheel out and twisted around the other side and put it on the required cog there. Now that wouldn't take as long as I've taken to describe it. The rapidity with which you got off the bicycle, you had in your mind exactly the gear that you required, and the wing nuts with the drop-out ends, and it was only a few seconds before you were back on the bicycle again.
What do you think about the modern bicycles in the shops now?
Oh, I've referred to the shorter wheelbase. Apart from that, I think that they're, with their light tubing that's developed from the technological advance in aeroplanes, of course, has been to the advantage of the tubing on a bicycle. And also the lightweight cranks and chain wheel and handlebars and saddle pillar and so on. The weight has become very, very much reduced, and let's be fair, it's easier cycling, but at the same time they're going faster. The speeds that they do are remarkable. The lighter tyres, of course, with the better surface of the roads, and the standard of cycling, I'm quite sure, the standard of the competitors is just as high as it ever was, although they have adjusted their training and their style of racing to all those new factors, and the 10-speed gears and even 15, I understand that they have, and so therefore it's they've moved with the times. I haven't got the slightest doubt but that if roads, due to a certain set of economic circumstances, became potholed and rough, and and they rode under the conditions that we did of the corrugations and the bad surfaces, I've got not the slightest doubt but that they'd adjust themselves to those conditions after a while and deal with them just as effectively as we did in our longer time events.
How much have the road conditions changed? Could you tell me anything about the conditions of the roads and some of your long rides?
Well, the cities, their roads finished, their good roads finished 5 and 6 miles out of the cities. For example, in the Sydney-Melbourne that I rode in 1929, the asphalt road finished at Liverpool 20 miles out, and it didn't commence again, excepting for running through the towns like Albury and and Wangaratta and Benalla and so on. You got a smooth stretch through the town. But apart from that, you didn't pick it up again until you got to Campbellfield out on the other side. The road varied in many respects, very much as it does today, even with the better surfaces. You find when you get over the border on the New South Wales side that they are not quite as good as they are in the Victorian area. But universally, they were bad. The road around Euroa, for example, wound from one side of the three-chain fence to the other in amongst the gum trees as motor cars made their own tracks according to the weather of that particular winter. And where there was metal, there were potholes. And I can remember one incident in 1924 where I was riding across to Sydney, the other side of Benalla, and the roads were so full of holes there that a couple of cars that had passed on a better piece of road, they couldn't overtake us on this bad road. The road as we know it, all roads have gone up dramatically. I think the greatest change that came in roads was from 1931 up to the war years, and I did a tremendous amount of training over roads between the capitals, and I was absolutely astonished at how each year you'd go and you'd find another 200 or 300 miles of asphalt road put down, until finally it was stretching between the majority of the principal towns and the cities, and that made a great difference to cycling times and cycling comfort.
The fight for the road between the bicycle and the car, has that changed much?
Yes, as the roads have improved, the motor cars obviously are in greater volume on the road. If you go into statistics, you'll find that in the 30s, I think it was 1 car in 10, and now when you get 1 car to 2.5 or 3 of the population, you're certainly congesting the roads, and undoubtedly they become more dangerous and more hazardous for cycling. You see the contrast in this respect, that one time every footpath at around 8 o'clock, from 7:30 to 8 o'clock, was really jammed in the suburbs with pedestrians walking to the tram or the train. Today you'll find a rare pedestrian, but with the roads choked with cars. They're in the cars going to the office, and I think that's the greatest contrast. And if I may say, I believe the time will come where you have the situation in the suburbs where footpaths should be defined, half of them, for cyclists, and because of the fact that they're safer for cyclists certainly, and they're not unsafe for pedestrians if reasonable care is taken by both parties.
Could you make any general comment about the bicycle as a means of transport?
Well, the bicycle has fascinated me over the years that I've been associated with it. Let me say that I started off with an inbuilt desire to ride a bicycle from the time that ever I saw anybody on one, and I suppose
barricades up. Sorry, as you were saying?
I suppose that I started with ahead of the average person in my inclination to ride a bicycle. But when you analyse the distances that can be ridden on a bicycle, without undue fatigue, compared with any other effort that's made by man to transport himself. You just get a wonderment at what can be done. I'll get away from myself, but the record from Land's End to John O'Groats now, which is 865 miles, on human effort by one John Woodburn, is an average of 19.25 miles an hour. And he covered 490 miles in the first 24 hours. Now, that's just done on personal propulsion. And then we get back to the early days of the pioneering period in Australia, from the 1880s on, as far as the bicycle was concerned, and we find that it was indispensable for the shearers to move from one grazing property to the other. It was absolutely essential for workers to be using bicycles in various cities of Australia, both from the economical point of view and, if they'd only known it, from their health point of view as well. And the study of the bicycle is a fascinating thing as far as returns for effort is concerned. And on the health side, on the economy side, on the enjoyment side, and from the point of view of the all-round features that it's got, the same machine can be used for all of those various activities. It's a most versatile contribution to a nation, and it's played a remarkable part in the history of Australia.
Just swapping back again to the road conditions, could you tell me about your first Nullarbor crossing? What was the road like there?
Well, actually there was, it varied too. From Merredin, about 150 miles out of Perth, there were only sand tracks to Kalgoorlie, corrugated sand tracks. At times, again, I was moving faster on the bicycle, wending my way along some sort of path compared with the official cars that were following. We struck into the Nullarbor Plain at Xanthus, from the train line at Xanthus, and made for the Madura Pass, and that was only limestone tracks. As a matter of fact, the tracks made by the dingo trappers who were in motor vehicles were sometimes more definable than was the main track. And it was limestone and sand. The limestone, of course, was bumpy and corrugated, and the sand was deep. But the Nanwarra sands, in the middle of the desert, I had to carry my bicycle for 10 miles there because it was absolutely impossible to ride. At Madura Pass, there was 2 miles of descent from the plateau down to sea level, and the cars and caravans that were following me, the official outfit, for checking and seeing the rules were observed. It took them half a day to get down because they had to jack them over the rocks. I carried my machine down, and until I got to Port Augusta, there was no asphalt at all from the time that I had left the streets of Kalgoorlie. From then on, right through to Sydney, the road was asphalt then. But I struck one thunderstorm in the crossing, and the road was flooded within, as such as it was flooded within a few minutes. The night riding was the most difficult of all, because the track wound sinuously through the sand hills, and the motor cars had to be close up behind me to give me light, and now and again there was a snake coiled up in the middle of the track in the wheel ruts, and to have put the brakes on and would have made it rather hazardous as far as the car behind, following so close behind, was concerned. And so there was only one thing to do, and that was to thump the front wheel down on the snake and raise from the saddle and hit the saddle hard as you sat back on it again, and hope for the best that it didn't come up through the wheels. So it was full of incident as far as I was concerned, but as for a road, as I say again, there was no road, it was only some sort of a track. At the year before, in 1936, they had held the first motor reliability trial in connection with the sesquicentenary of South Australia. And they only had 7 cars, and it was considered an epic feat to have carried out the reliability trial at that time.
With those long record-breaking rides, how did you feel at the end of the road, at the end of the ride?
Well, this is the remarkable thing about the bicycle. Anybody that rides a bicycle over any distances at all, in any prolonged time, will realise that they go through certain fluctuations of energy. That's the remarkable part about it, how, in the vernacular of the cyclist, you come good. And so that when I arrived in Sydney, I felt far better than I had at times out on the desert. And it depended on the time of the day or night as well. There were times after 1,000 miles when I felt that I wanted to give up. There were other times when I felt what a marvellous thing cycling was. So I suppose it was the exhilaration of arriving in Sydney. I suppose it was the uplifting effect of the crowd that was waiting for one, and all of those factors that combined to make you feel that you weren't as exhausted as you had been in earlier parts of the ride. And so the answer to that is I felt pretty good. As a matter of fact, the Sydney Morning Herald made arrangements for me to go to a doctor shortly after the ride and to check me over and for my heart, see. And he said, look, if any damage had been done to your heart, he said, you'd have still been out on the desert. You wouldn't have continued on with the ride, so I'll do it. But he said, I'll make the test, but I know what I'll find. And he found that the heart was in perfect condition. But this is the point. While you were doing the cycling ride, you were eating the right food, the correct food, and the freewheeling down the hills, you were getting a certain amount of rest, and any rest I had over the last 3 or 4 days was in snatches of half an hour, and on the last 2 days I found they were giving me 10 minutes of sleep and then waking me up, and I really thought that I had a half an hour. I had no consciousness of time at all. But if I had, having finished the bike ride, then gone out on a series of late nights, celebrations and what have you, that would have been where the damage would have been done. But obviously you took fine care, you took good care to have the requisite amount of recuperation afterwards. Although when I say that, I remember that in the Paris-Brest-Paris, which was 726 miles non-stop from Paris to Brest and back in 1931, that the race then took 49 minutes, 21 seconds, I think it was from memory, and without sleep. And immediately I stepped off the machine, having won the race. I had a telegram from Antwerp asking me to appear in a 100 miles race on the Tuesday, and this was the Thursday. And so there were 3 or 4 of us who'd been in the race who were at Antwerp because they wanted to see us, to see these fellows who'd ridden Paris-Brest-Paris. And we finished. We didn't win, but we finished.
At what stage do you think you pushed yourself the furthest?
Oh, undoubtedly the Tour de France of 1928. We were a team of 4. There was Ernie Bainbridge and Percy Osborne and Harry Watson of New Zealand and myself. We were selected from a 685 miles 4-stage race around Victoria, and it caused such a great deal of interest that they thought, the cycling people, that we had qualified to ride in the Tour de France, and they made arrangements accordingly. A public fund was raised, and we were put in a training camp in France, and we got into a really new world of cycling, and it was an education to us immediately. And but the formula of the race was over the 3,300 miles of the Tour de France, was 22 stages and divided according to distance over the Pyrenees and the Alps. There was one stage that started at midnight, was 250 miles, and longer distances than we'd known in Australia. But the greatest handicap to us was that we had only 4 riders in our team, and we had 14 stages of the 22 that were against the clock. That is, we were set off at 10-minute intervals between teams, and our time was taken as individuals. Now, in cycling, pacing means a tremendous difference and is a great asset to the person who's being paced. I suppose that sitting on the wheel, as we term it, a man in second position and following close behind, it's perhaps 5% easier, particularly against the headwind, than it is out in front. And that is why you see in cycle track pursuit races, such as in the Olympic Games, with 4 men, that they alternately change each lap, each one taking his turn of pacing in front, because, as I say, it's more difficult than sitting on the wheel. And a cyclist recuperates very quickly, one in form, by sitting on the wheel. Now, if that be so, you can understand what it's like for 4 riders to be against 10. And we had 14 stages such as that. And in France, they said that we'd be back in Paris within 3 stages. And the fact that we 3 of us finished the Tour de France was extolled over there as a tremendous effort as far as we were concerned, being such a small team. And I think it called for tremendous efforts, day after day, racing against these teams. Some days we finished second or third team out of the 8 or 9 teams that there were from these other countries. And we're representing Australia, and we felt that we just couldn't pull out. And I never went through any continual muscular agony as I did in that Tour de France, because when we got to the Pyrenees and the Alps, after the exhaustion of these races against the clock, we were so tired to commence the climbing of the Pyrenees and the Alps instead of being relatively fresh, as were the other teams. And they were in the mass start races, and to get over those Alps and the Pyrenees, I have never, in any stage of my cycling, put forward the same efforts as I did then. And I always said that if I'm in form, I will never be afraid of any distance or any race, having gone through that particular efforts in that first Tour de France.